Good evening, everyone. I'm Sarah McDougall, Director at Ben Urry and Curator of the current exhibition, Sheer Verve, the Women's International Art Club. Thank you very much for attending the online event this evening. And just a reminder, as I'm sure you all know, that it's being recorded, so we're kindly asking you to keep your cameras turned off and microphones muted to lessen any possible interference. The chat function will be open throughout the presentation, so do please type in any questions, and after the presentation I'll fit in as many as I can. I'm really delighted to introduce this week's speaker, Dr. Lucy Howarth. Lucy is an art historian and curator and lecturer. Her interests are in contemporary art and design and 20th century modernism, with a particular focus on the art movement constructivism and issues of gender in relation to histories. Her PhD was completed in 2009 at the University of Plymouth, and it was on the queer British constructivist artist Marlow Moss, the subject of her talk this evening, and focused on the intersection of practice and legacy. Since then, Lucy has published several articles on Moss and the lovely Book for the Modern Women Artist series, Ida Down Books. She's also curated Moss displays at Tate Britain, Tate St Ives, Hastings Contemporary, Leeds Art Gallery, and the Museum Haus Konstruktiv in Zurich. She currently teaches contextual and theoretical studies at the University for the Creative Arts in Canterbury, and she continues her work on Moss. And now over to you, Lucy.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. And thank you, Reiko and everybody at the Ben Urry Gallery, and especially to Una Richmond, who invited me in to contribute to Sheer Verve with Marlow Moss. And thank you to Tim for the loan. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So, join the club, Marlow Moss and the WIAC. Or this was my slightly lengthier title, Join the Club, Marlow Moss in the WIAC and the Queer Feminism, Gender Constructivism Conundrum. I'm afraid I couldn't quite let go of that as a title, even though I agree it's a little bit wordy. On the occasion of the display of the 1953 sculpture by Marlow Moss, Construction Spatial, at the Ben Urry Gallery and Museum in London, as part of the exhibition Sheer Verve, I have been asked to speak on Moss, to introduce her to possibly a new audience, and the particular problematics of Moss as a queer artist in the Women's International Art Club. The Ben Urry Gallery is a pertinent context for Moss, for other reasons too, on Boundary Road in Kilburn, on Boundary Road off Abbey Road in London. We're just a short walk from Moss's birthplace in Kilburn on the 29th of May, 1889, and her subsequent home in Bronsbury Villas, before the family moved south of the river to Richmond. She returned to this neighbourhood in her 20s when she studied at St John's Wood School of Art, before the Slade, eventually moving to Paris and attending the Académie Moderne. Ben Urry Gallery celebrates Jewish, refugee and immigrant contributions to British visual culture. Moss was Jewish, and despite being British by birth, she was also a wartime refugee from Europe, leaving her home in France and then fleeing the Netherlands in a fishing boat as the Nazis invaded Zealand in 1940. Back in England, settled in farthest West Cornwall, Moss initially found it difficult to make connections and find opportunities to exhibit, but she showed with the WIAC in London annually, 1951 to 1956, and became a member in 1953. She was posthumously included in the 1963 show, as told to me by Una. She would have either applied for membership or been invited to become a member. She would have paid a membership fee and been invited to the WIAC AGM each year. There are no records of her attending any meetings, though. The WIAC was not the only club Moss was a member of. Throughout her professional career as an artist, beginning in the late 1920s, she was keen to connect with other artists and exhibit her work. But the WIAC is the only one defined by gender. This is of particular interest in light of Moss's ambiguous gender presentation, an aspect of her identity certainly pertinent to her historical exclusions, social and artistic, and now a significant catalyst of her re-emergence. Moss's legacy might have been different if she had followed her abstraction création comrade Piet Mondrian to New York during the war, as he had urged, or even returned to France after the war as she planned. Instead, she went to Le Morne in Cornwall, and apart from sojourns to the Netherlands, she stayed there. This was, of course, not exactly a backwater, but a thriving enclave of modernism, or nearby St. Ives was, to a certain extent. Ben Nicholson, however, ignored Moss's attempts to introduce herself by letter in the first few years she lived in Penwith. So was this rudeness, or misogyny, or homophobia? Or was it that Nicholson wasn't inclined to welcome an artist his senior, arriving from Europe more closely associated with Mondrian than he, and more committed to constructivism? Barbara Hepworth, whom Moss had met in Paris already, exhibited strong prejudice against queer sexualities, even in the case of her close friend, the potter Jane Leach, as described by Ian Massey in the recent book Queer St. Ives. This was not an uncommon attitude, of course. Whatever the reason, Moss was bereft of professional allies upon her return to England, and therefore she sought out connections where she could. The WIAC was a club that would have her as a member. Although Herbert Reed did include Moss in his 1959 concise history of modern painting, her position is subtly denigrated in relation to Nicholson's, deliberately or not, by the illustration of a late work only. This, as discussed by Florette Dijkstra, makes Moss seem like a throwback in the chronology rather than a contemporary of Nicholson and Hepworth. Despite the best efforts of Tate director Norman Reed and keeper of the modern collection Ronald Alley, who proposed Moss works in the early 1970s, purchases were stymied by the trustees. According to gallerist Peter Gimple, writing to Sidney Janis in New York, the 1975 London Moss show was a great disappointment in terms of sales, in comparison to Zurich the year before. Little catalogue, both shows here. Moss's métier of neoplasticism and constructivism was just not to British tastes. But further than this, Michael Caney, who had been curator of the Newlyn Art Gallery, considered her absence from British art as somewhere between malevolent and conspiratorial. He held accountable those he termed as the Nicholson-Hepworth clique, particularly their son-in-law, Alan Bowness, director of Tate in the 1980s. His 1985 exhibition established a narrative. There is an idea that Bowness deliberately kept Moss's works off the walls. This is very much not the case now. Interest in Moss has been on the increase since Dijkstra's work in the 90s. Tate St. Ives showed her installation in 1997 and has continued to propel the reappraisal of Moss since. After my PhD, engaging me to curate a display that travelled from Tate St. Ives to Jerwood Hastings Contemporary, to Leeds Art Gallery, and then to Tate Britain in 2013 to 2015, and also publishing my research on the Tate website and in the Tate magazine. Moss is now routinely included in collection displays at Tate, currently headlining the Modern Landscape Room at Tate St. Ives as one of the 5 key artists spotlighted and represented on posters around the town, and featured in the May 2023 rehang of the collection at Tate Britain. Tate has also produced video content raising Moss's profile. Long-held archival material is now catalogued and made publicly accessible. And new photographs have been accessioned. Tate has now made 2 significant purchases of Moss works. The first of which, in 2015, was this work, in time for the Tate Britain iteration of my display. White and Yellow of 1935 crucially redresses the balance in terms of date. It is one of the earliest examples of a series of works Moss made in the period prior to the start of the war, with string and eventually rope glued onto the canvas. It also includes variations of the infamous double line. More about that later. Moss chose this work to represent herself in the final cahier Abstraction Création Art Non Figuratif in 1936. The purchase, during the directorship of Penelope Curtis, represents a further progression of the gradual sea change in a British view of Moss. Previously, and also under the stewardship of Curtis, so no coincidence, Leeds was the only UK national collection to have bought a Moss work in 2004. In 2018, Tate made a further purchase of a sculpture. And this was in celebration. This was purchased in celebration of the centenary of women gaining the right to vote in Britain. Interest in Moss continues in Europe. I curated a Forgotten Maverick at Museum Haus Constructive in Zurich in 2017 with director Sabine Satchel. We produced this book as well, so that's also out there, as well as my small book on Moss. So Moss works held in their respective collections are on the walls of the Stedelijk in Amsterdam and the Kunstmuseum in Den Haag. Like Tate, many of the institutions that hold Moss works acquired them through donation rather than budgeted acquisition. Both the Stedelijk and the Israel Museum Jerusalem obtained their Moss works through gifts from Moss's heir and stepson, Stephen Nehoff, aka the photographer Stephen Storm, care of Willem Sandberg, who moved from one institution to the other at the time of the Stedelijk show in 1962, of which this is the catalogue of the Stedelijk show. However, recently there have been purchases of Moss works by the Kunstmuseum Basel and now the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, where a 20th century modernism wartime context is evoked. So we're looking here at a Marlow Moss painting through the wings of a biplane. The Rijksmuseum purchases, so 2 drawings as well as this painting, were spearheaded by new curator Mels Evers, who went there from Tate Britain after working on the collection rehang that includes Moss, and Hendrika Kriebolder, who is significantly the first woman to serve on the board of directors there. The acquisition was made possible with the financial support of the Women of the Rijksmuseum Fund. I went to Amsterdam to discuss Moss as a woman and artist with them a few months back. In composition, this work relates closely to what I believe is another painting, but could actually be an earlier version of the same canvas, and that's known only from a black and white photograph in the Paul Vézelay collection kept in the Tate archives. The difference being that that one includes red and is entitled Composition in Red, Black and White. Upon a close examination of this work, White and Black number 27, some traces of red pigment can almost be perceived, but nothing is certain. White and Black number 27 was reserved at the Gimpel and Hanover Gallery in Zurich for the Tate Gallery collection by Sir Norman Reed in 1973, along with White and Yellow that we were looking at moments ago. Both purchases were vetoed by the trustees, and the works were instead sold to a collector in Switzerland. And that's where they remained for some time. A close relation to White and Black number 27 is the moss painting held by MoMA in New York, composition in black and white number 4, 1949, on the wall as part of the collection display there. 27 is a studio number written on the back of the frame, probably later by Nettie Nahov. Number 27 on her undated handwritten inventory of Moss's works matches the title, date and measurements. It doesn't relate to the later work being called number 4, and this is the kind of cataloguing problem I have. Moss now frequently appears in exhibitions at national institutions. She was up at Tate Britain for Queer British Art in 2017 and Virginia Woolf at Tate St Ives in 2018, so that's a queer context and then a feminist one. She appears most frequently in exhibitions around women artists, such as 50 works by 50 British women artists in London and Leeds in 2019, and several in Paris recently. There was Dimensions of Reality, Female Minimal at Tadeusz Ropak in 2020, Elle von l'Abstraction at the Pompidou Centre in 21, and Pioneers at the Musée de Luxembourg in 2022. So they were all exhibitions looking at women artists that featured Moss. And my own book in the Eider Down series is part of a modern women artists series. And of course, also the current show at the Ben Uri about the WIAC. Much of Tate's recent video output on Moss has an LGBTQIA+ perspective. And there is a Queer St Ives show coming up that will include Moss. Much of the Tate video material and an audio description of White and Yellow uses a gender-neutral pronoun for Moss. This is caveated on the Tate website with a note on language as an option that honours all possibilities and draws no conclusions. It's acknowledged that it's impossible to know how Moss might identify if she was alive today. And to that, I want to add that Moss gave no clear indication of her position at the time. And this wasn't the focus of her work. A discussion of Moss's gender identity is the main theme of the Tate Kids page, Who is Marlow Moss? And YouTuber Ollie Pike's take on Moss for the video 5 LGBTQ art stories, both intended as discussion prompts for school children. Tate is at the forefront of cultural institutions revising and diversifying the presentation of material histories and addressing new and multiple audiences, resulting in a curatorial approach that foregrounds Moss as simultaneously female, queer, trans, and non-binary. A small backlash against this accelerated in the right-wing British press in May this year, following a Twitter thread with accusations of wokeism and the expunging of Moss's female sex. And this was not without a distinct transphobic agenda. The live issue of pronouns has been for some time now something institutions question me on, wanting guidance or a position from me. This was a subject of discussion at the Rijksmuseum most recently. And I welcome a multiplicity of voices on this and see no need for a defining statement. My general use of female pronouns for Moss is in keeping with the period and Moss's own frame of reference. In some circumstances, a neutral pronoun is preferred in English, but this is apparently more linguistically difficult in Dutch. The documentary film, The Disappearing Lines of Marlow Moss, premiered with an accompanying archival presentation at the MUCA in Antwerp in the summer of 2022. This is particularly significant as hitherto unseen material and works by Moss were made accessible through this film. And it really succeeds in gathering voices on Moss, including Andreas Ostuk, heir to Moss and the Nahovs, and holder of the exhibited material, and Bart de Beer, the museum director, and Dijkstra, and Ankie de Jonge Mullen, and Matthijs Erdmann, and myself. And I have some stills from the film here. This is me walking towards the Nahov family home where Moss spent time. And here's Andreas with his suitcase of Moss-related material. The display included hitherto unknown works by Moss, such as these two relief constructions. So these were a great surprise to me. It's a photo taken by Florette Dijkstra there. You can see her reflected in the glass. So Moss sought and established artistic connections in England after the war. She did this locally in Cornwall, showing several times at the Ara Gallery in Mousehole throughout the 1940s and 50s, and even with the Penwith Society in St Ives on at least one occasion in 1951. She had London representation with Erica Browson's Hanover Gallery. She had solo exhibitions there in 1953 and 1958 and was included in group shows. In 1955, she took part in significant London exhibitions, Group Espace at the Royal Festival Hall and Measurement and Proportion at the Artists International Association Gallery. She continued to show in Paris with the Salon des Indépendants and 50 Years of Abstract Painting at Gallery Cruz in 1957. And she also exhibited in New York in 1942 at the American British Art Centre, possibly on the instigation of Mondrian, and again in 1956 via the Hanover Gallery and Erica Browson. It was, however, not easy at all for Moss to find these opportunities, not as it had been in Paris before the war, where she was founder member of Abstraction Création and closely involved with Mondrian's circle. She had been in key European constructivist exhibitions like Constructivisten at the Kunsthal Basel in 1937 and Abstract Kunst at the Stedelijk Amsterdam in 1938. Membership of the WIAC was part of her effort to maintain a presence on an international stage as this network dissipated. Although it was not an avant-garde group aesthetically and strove to avoid a political or feminist stance per se, the WIAC was in fact diverse and liberal to a greater extent than many self-proclaimed radical groups. Moss and her partner, Antoinette Hendrika Nijhoff-Wind, Nettie, had many significant friendships with queer figures across Europe. Here you see her with Nettie and Marika de la Salle and Anna Blaman and Albert Moll. Just go back to that. So the Duchess de la Salle is probably best known through Tamara de Lempicka's portrait of her here. So that's her with Moss standing up. And there she is with various other friends. So LGBT comradeship was clearly important to Moss. There were many same-gender partnerships within the WIAC, including Ethel Sands and Anna Hope Hudson, Florence Weil and Frances Loring, Maud Squire and Ethel Mars, Anne Faulkner and Leslie Hervey, Martha Stettler and Alice Dannenberg, and Edith Somerville and Alice Kinkead. Other known lesbian artists at the WIAC included Julian Phelps Allen, Claire Atwood, Adge Baker, Joan Erdley, Dorothea Larcher, Patricia Priest, and Nasta Rock. The WIAC was an inclusive space. Although overt constitutional support for a queer agenda was not within the cultural lexicon of the time, this would have been clear to those who knew it. Queer histories are not easy to trace, as relationships and sexual identities are often undefined and unrecorded or shrouded in denial and secrecy and euphemism. Spinsters often shared their lives as sisters or companions. The few photographs that exist of Moss and her friends are precious artifacts. A key LGBTQ figure of the WIAC was Ethel Walker, a member for over 40 years, now generally considered to have been in a youthful partnership with a fellow painter, Clara Christian, who provided Walker with a permanent home and studio despite marrying and moving out and marrying a man herself. And this isn't them. This is Iris and Kathleen, apparently. In her lifetime, Walker was a celebrated painter representing Britain at the Venice Biennale 4 times. She was a prolific exhibitor, active at the Royal Academy, the Society of Women Artists, the New English Art Club, and the London Group, as well as the WIAC, of which she was president 1931 to 1945, so just before Moss's time there. She was an energetic advocate for women artists. Even so, her ambivalence about the ghettoisation of her sex is apparent. On the occasion of her 1938 appointment as a commander of the British Empire, she was described as England's leading woman artist, an accolade to which she responded curtly, "There is no such thing as a woman artist. There are only two kinds of artists, bad and good. You can call me a good artist if you like." It's not recorded what Walker made of Moss's constructivist art, but similarly to discussions of Moss's double line as a queering gesture, Walker's female portraits and nudes can and have been read as lesbian. So I might pause here for a moment and explain, as it might be a little harder to read this visually, how a double line might be a queer line. The German gender theorist Kati Rotger, in a book called Differences Within Gender Studies, published in the 90s, made this reading of Moss's work. The double line was a significant innovation by Moss in terms of the formal language of neoplasticism, and was adopted by Mondrian and other artists too in the early 1930s. It led to Mondrian proposing Moss to George Fontonnelleau and Theo van Doesburg to join them in the inauguration of the new association Abstraction Création. So this here is an iteration of the double line, two parallel lines, in this case red and of equal breadth, travelling across the composition. Moss saw this as a way to introduce space, movement and light. In January 1931, she exhibited two paintings, both featuring double lines. Moss had discovered that the secret of form lies not in form itself, but in the continual changing and shifting of forms. So that's a quote from Neyhoff in the Stedelijk catalogue of 1962. Mondrian had questioned the purpose of Moss's double line, and she responded at great length to him with drawings and calculations, and she explained that she found the single line grid of Mondrian's neoplasticism to be a conclusion and a restriction to a composition. So their discourse was that of constructivism. But now Moss's double line can be understood as a doubling, a presentation of alternatives and equivalents, so a queering gesture. The pictorial movement it achieves sets in motion borderlines. The Hanover Gallery, too, was an actively pro-queer platform. However, despite Browson's own gender and sexual orientation, she was lesbian, she concentrated on the platforming of male artists, particularly Francis Bacon and Richard Hamilton, as certainly more financially viable. The women she represented, other than Moss, were Florence Henry and Leonore Finney, whose careers and reputations, I would say, have suffered from the baked-in misogyny of the surrealist group rather than their queerness. Reception in the British press of the Hanover Gallery shows frequently and lazily compared Moss to Mondrian and demonstrated what she was up against in terms of societal prejudices as a woman. One reviewer found Moss's work strongly evocative of some southern coastal resort getting itself spick and span for the season. Where Mondrian made work capable of gravity, Moss merely added brightness to whiteness, a phrase that references the slogan of Omo washing powder, and used geometry like a housewife might use a gadget. The Times review congratulated Moss for displaying the calmness and gentleness of the woman artist, which is nearly as bad. The most expansive review came from the Jewish Chronicle. They wrote, "It's good to have another exhibition by Marlow Moss at the Hanover Gallery. Against the background of paintings that conform with the principles of her master, Mondrian, are sculptures, some rectilinear and some based on curves. In the centre of the gallery is a large white composition of an ovoid and cylindrical form on an irregular pentagonal base. Another satisfying experience is a small group of a cone balanced on two spheres." So that's clearly this piece that is being referred to. "One small and one solid. the other large and conically pierced. This is in gunmetal on Cornish granite and is rich in reflections. A little catalogue from the 1953 Hanover show. An absorbing work, I'm continuing with the Jewish Chronicle here, is Forms in Space of polished brass, a relationship of a large and small sphere with a gyration of engirdling wire stemming from the large sphere. It's significant that it's mainly Moss's sculpture that is discussed here, and that she exhibited almost exclusively sculpture at the WIAC, one of the very few participants to do so. The description of Forms in Space is very similar to Spheres in Curved Line of 1945, as recently acquired by Kunstmuseum in Basel. This is a remarkable piece, conceived in the round. The constituent objects are atomic and planetary. The orbiting line recalls a Mobius strip. In Moss's piece for the Cahiers Abstraction Création Art Non Figurative of 1932, she wrote that the aim of her art was to fully express the artist's awareness of the universe. She is simultaneously concerned with the microcosm and the macrocosm, herself and everything outside of herself. Consciousness and the universe are mutually defined and sometimes even interchangeable. Moss had been a professional member of the Artists International Association since 1942. Her application form, can be understood as a signalling of a genderless identity, in that she used only her self-appointed name, very clearly stating Moss, Marlow, and then in brackets Marlow Moss, and ignoring the requirement to indicate a gendering title of Mr., Mrs., or Miss. It is possible that it is the AIA affiliation that led Moss to join the WIAC, as this was a well-trodden path, as described by Katie Deepwell in her book, Women Artists Between the Wars. It is most likely that Browson of the Hanover encouraged Moss to join the WIAC, as she was on the advisory council between 1951 and 1965. And here is Erica Browson in her Hanover gallery, unfortunately not with Moss works in the background. Parisian origin of the WIAC as the Paris Club for International Women Artists and its European international outlook would have appealed greatly to Moss too. The intersection of female, queer, Jewish identities around Moss is a fascinating territory. The ancient Jewish Talmud defines 8 gender designations, and although Moss was non-practicing, this forms part of her backdrop spectrum of options available when forming her identity. In the present context of the Ben Uri Gallery, it is particularly apposite to reference Moss's Jewishness, or even her immigrantness in England, rather than her expatness in Europe. Despite the fact she was born in London to British parents, she appeared to her neighbours in Lamorna as foreign in some way, even with a non-specific European accent. This is how she was remembered. I think that's an erroneous translation of a perceived eccentricity, of course, perhaps conflated with awareness of Moss's partner being Dutch, but there was something exotic about Moss to them. London was a long way from Lamorna, never mind European avant-garde. Local children initially took her for a gentleman, but they weren't sure. The shipping line, the family business on Moss's mother's side and source of wealth once the Moss sisters were under the guardianship of their uncle, sailed under the Israeli flag. John Isaac Jacobs was on the committee of several Jewish charities, and family weddings took place in the synagogue. Descendants of Moss's family now characterize in conversation with me that their religious ethnic identity is one of having an awareness of being Jewish, rather than undertaking any Jewish practice in terms of dietary law or Sabbath restrictions. And they assume this has been the case going back beyond Moss's generation. It's important to acknowledge, though, that Moss was from a Jewish family, and of course it holds a weight and significance and tangible danger at this particular point in history, when Moss must have felt hyper-aware of her Jewishness. Certainly, this must be the explanation of this. Her certificate of holy baptism during the war. Pragmatism on Moss's part, and the kindness and inclusivity demonstrated by the gatekeeper of a rural church is worth noting. Tolerance, ambivalence, generosity, acceptance of nebulous concepts, and a certain ease with an undefined state are maybe achieved amongst village children and provincial communities to a greater extent than in British modernist circles, contemporary culture wars, and academic discourse. And the same can be said of the WIAC. Feminist art histories have had at times a conundrum with constructivism and consequently ignored it, and vice versa. Gillian Wise explained to me her many aversions to being characterised as a woman artist, or actually being written about by a woman writer, at great length in conversation with me and by letter. But she, like Moss, as well as being a constructivist, was an internationalist and a pragmatist who wanted to operate professionally and exhibit her work. Wise showed with the WIAC herself in 1961 and 1962. Sadly, she's no longer around for me to ask her what her motivations were for this, but I think I understand. The sculpture on show at the Ben Uri Gallery for sheer verve, construction spatial, invites a symbolist reading almost. The larger body is an ovoid, an egg, a pod, ripe for interpretation, and the smaller is a sphere. A relationship is apparent. So are the forms, therefore, two beings? It's hard not to anthropomorphize. Or are they alien? They are futuristic or retro-futuristic now. They are sci-fi and even humorful. They are somewhere between natural and cultural. Orbiting forms appear frequently in Moss's drawings. Additionally, this piece has an objet trouvé surrealist aspect with the use of ready-made adjustable tripod legs, like some sort of engineering or nautical instrument. This work, like much of Moss's oeuvre, was lost for many years and only resurfaced once an archival photograph was recognised during the Howarth Gallery run in 2014. Some drawings by Moss. This is one of the ones at the Rijksmuseum. Beyond the issue of Moss's gender identity and pronouns, there is an essential conundrum between feminism and constructivism that Moss, as an artistic historical figure, makes apparent. Forgive me if I wander away from Moss for a moment in order to consider this. Constructivism came out of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. It ideologically positioned itself apart from art and bourgeois notions of high culture. The objects that were produced and exhibited were experiments and even referred to as laboratory work, a precursor of our current notion of art as research. The ism came about in 1921 as the title of an exhibition in Moscow. Constructivist was meant to replace the word artist and came directly from the metaphorical language of Lenin, building of communist culture and construction of communism, etc. In keeping with a communist conception, the constructivists sought to vanquish the presence of the individual creator in the art object and favoured an aesthetic of industrial production. With the hand of the artist eliminated, so was the body. This work had no gender. Constructivism freed artists from gender identity. And in a patriarchal world, this is more significant for women, of course. The Russian constructivist movement had the largest proportion of female contributors of any avant-garde movement. Alexandra Exter, Natalia Gonkarova, Lyubov Popova, Olga Rozanova, Varvara Stepanova, Nadezhda Uldovtsova. Interestingly, there was no fashion amongst these women to dress in a masculine style, as Moss did. Maybe this is because rather than equating modernity with masculinity, as was so in Paris, the Russians identified themselves with the cultural other, the artisan craft worker. The European iteration of constructivism in the 20th century continues this tradition and is full of female practitioners too, including those in Paris before the Second World War under the umbrella of abstraction création, like Moss and also Sophie Tober-Arp, Katarzyna Kobro, Sonia Deloney, Paul Vézelay, Hannah Kosnick-Kloss and Barbara Hepworth, and after the war, artists such as Mary Martin and Jocelyn Chewett and Gillian Wise. So it's odd that constructivism, the art movement with the greatest proportion and most consistent presence of female practitioners at its forefront, is habitually characterized as masculine. But with its hard straight lines and its austere aesthetic and its allusion to mathematics, it still often is. Has this resulted in an aversion to constructivism on the part of feminist writers, and thus a compounding of the neglect and exclusion of Moss? Feminist revisers Griselda Pollock and Rosika Parker focus instead on Artemisa Gentileschi, Judith Leyster, Angelica Kaufman, Berta Morisot, Mary Cassatt, Gwen John, Paula Modersohn Becker, Frida Kahlo, etc., etc. Even books such as Jill Perry's Women Artists in the Parisian Avant-Garde do not include Moss. And although Katie Deepwell's Women Artists and Modernism and Women Artists Between the Wars do mention Moss, it's only ever within a list of other excluded female artists. Moss's work is undiscussed. And I think maybe this is because it just isn't feminine enough or representational enough to be useful in these kind of discussions. Moss's work and work of this ilk is not representational in any straightforwardly literal way of any ideology, including gender identity, although constructivism is always underpinned with a utopianism. Its silence can leave space for speculation. Many female artists choose to work in an abstract way specifically for this reason, to avoid gendered receptions of their work. The move away from figuration, particularly the cis male sexually domineering images of the female nude that were so prevalent in the 20th century in avant-garde movements, it was a degendering move, and it opened up the field to others. The question of whether or not Moss's work is in itself feminist, in Pollock's terms, whether it has political effect as a feminist intervention according to the way the work acts upon, makes demands of, and produces positions for its viewers, is surely unequivocally yes, once it is contextualized. The presence of Moss in an exhibition such as this at the Ben-Uri Gallery about the WIAC necessitates a reframing and a complicating of feminist discourses, an ongoing project underway. In November 2020, my Blue Plaque nomination of Moss for her childhood home nearby the Ben-Uri Gallery was rejected from shortlisting on the grounds of her current profile not being strong enough. I was advised that a reapplication can be considered in 10 years, and maybe by then her reputation will have been consolidated. And this is particularly disappointing as English Heritage are once again bemoaning the lack of women celebrated by the scheme and issuing calls in the national press. It can be hard to unpick intersectional discrimination in retrospect, but it is clear to me that the most overriding factor in Moss's various exclusions was her perceived female sex, and that not only did the WIAC provide a space for women, it did not discriminate against personalities, queer identities, age or ethnicities, and unlike St. Ives, social affiliations were not a prerequisite. Moss's professional pragmatism superseded any concern she may have had with identifying herself as a woman artist. The Women's International Art Club was a place for her, and she aligned herself with them. And we can just see inside one of the WIAC catalogues here, that's Moss's name. It's interesting to note that her prices are quite high in comparison. And then this is the front cover of the Parisian edition. So Moss aligned herself with the WIAC, just as she had with abstraction création in the early part of her career. The 1933 edition of Abstraction and Création, Art Non-Figuratif, stated in its editorial, translated here from the French, Abstraction and Creation number 2 appears at a moment when free thought is being ferociously attacked. This cahier presents works and declarations of independent artists who try, each on their own, to respond to the cultural demands of the time. They don't agree on all points, but believe that all tendencies should be fulfilled. Any limiting of artistic efforts by consideration of race, ideology, or nationality are odious. They place themselves under the banner of total opposition to oppression, under whatever order it may be. And this is what Moss sought in the WIAC. She was included in the 1963 WIAC exhibition, along with many others posthumously. By this point, before the feminist revisions of the following decade, the WIAC could already see the importance of forming a new history and historiography. So there you see, under some women artists of the past, we have 2 works by Moss. This is the work lent by Erica Browson for the WIAC show before she bequeathed it to Tate 6 years later. And then this is the note on Moss in the WIAC catalogue, 1962. It says, Marlow Moss died 1958, studied in Paris under Léger and Ozenfant during the 1920s, and was one of the original members of the group Abstraction Création from its foundation in 1931 until it ended in 1939. She was a close personal friend of Mondrian and was associated with the constructivist movement in the 1930s. After the war, she became a member of the Reality Nouvelle. She was a member of the WIAC for some years and exhibited regularly. And there's a photograph of Moss's studio in Lamorna at the time of her death in 1958. And I'm done, Sarah.
Hello, I'm back. I was struggling to unmute myself there, and I will be resuming.
Everybody had left.
Not at all. Okay, I'm back. So apologies for leaving you wondering where I was there. I think I was absolutely absorbed in your talk, and yes, the technology was not allowing me to join you. That was a really fantastic, rich talk. You went back and forth discussing the aspects of her identity, her gender, how she identified, how the work suggested or not the groups. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions from our audience, so let's just see what's coming through. Flip is saying, thanks Lucy, sublime information about MM, you're the greatest, clearly a fan. While everybody else is getting their questions ready, I just wanted to kick off with one about how Moss appeared to come fully formed as a modernist. All the works are so sophisticated and elegant and clearly, you know, belong to the constructivist movement, as you've identified. Is there actually any earlier work? Was there a transitional period, or did she just excise that from her record?
Well, I mean, obviously there must have been early work. She was a student at St John's Wood, nearby where you are, and she was a student at the Slade, and she was a student at the Académie Moderne in Paris. And I would love to see her student work. but unfortunately I haven't. I don't know it. It doesn't exist. There's been a couple of earlier works that are kind of uncertain in their authentication. There's potentially kind of cubist self-portrait, but no, really she does kind of arrive with us fully formed as a constructivist, which kind of adds to her mystery a lot. It's I think it's caused problems for her story, because Mondrian has such a good story of his development into abstraction, and there's this kind of a trope where an artist kind of demonstrates their facility at life drawing and shows that they're a bona fide, excellent skilled artist, and then they go abstract, and so we don't have that kind of narrative with Moss. So yeah, for better or for worse, her work is her entire oeuvre is constructivist.
Well, I know that she won't be the only modern artist to have done that. Now the questions are coming in thick and fast, so let me put some to you. So Tina Matanya asks, where do you think her interest in the universe and representing planets originated from? Was there a parallel interest in science, or only association with fellow artists?
Well, I think these interests were common amongst many constructivist artists. Other artists wrote about, and Noam Garbo writes particularly well about these ideas, and I think his writing would have resonated with Moss. She I don't think they actually met in St. Ives, but there was a point when they were both around at the same time. But I think she must have attended to Garbo's writing on these things, because there seems to be a lot of connection, and so it wasn't uncommon amongst constructivist artists to be thinking in these terms of the universe. But I love those quotes by Moss. She didn't write much, so what she did write is really kind of precious, and everything she writes is just big. She doesn't she doesn't no small talk. It's just the universe.
I'm going to stop you there just because I've got so many other questions all popping in now. Miriam Jackson thanks you for a great talk, and she asks whether Moss and Gluck knew one another.
Oh, well, I mean, they were both in Lamorna, so they must have done, but
okay.
I don't have any record of it, but yeah, they were both in Lamorna. Their dates are practically the same. They must have done.
Bazu Dogramassi, who's joining us from Munich, also thanks you for the wonderful talk and asks if you could speak again about the double line as queer.
Okay, yeah, I probably
missed some of that.
It's a complicated issue. It's this, okay, so example of the double line, it comes in lots of forms, but this the double line is this doubling of a line that it's kind of Moss's invention. It's very important in terms of neoplasticism and constructivism. It was a big discussion point at the time between her and Mondrian and von Tonnelou and Goran, and they all experimented with it. So to them it was a purely formal constructivist issue, and it's only in recent times, well, specifically in an essay written and published in Germany in 1999 by a theorist called Kati Rotke, where it was explored as a queer line because of its being it's this idea that Moss had, that it's set in motion, space, movement and light. Kati Rotke was saying, well, it also kind of sets in motion gender categories. If Mondrian's grid was single lines, that's kind of your one answer. Moss's double line gives you parallels and equivalents, and other alternatives, and this can be read as a queering. it's interesting. I like it as an idea. I don't know if Moss would in any way relate to it or object to it. It's an idea that's very much developed in the 90s and kind of applied retrospectively, and you can see how it means that, I mean, Cathy Rothko literally used this painting as the image on the front of her book. So I think I said in my talk that Moss's work is largely silent, and I think this silence can give space for ideas to be kind of imprinted upon it, for better or for worse. You know, I think it's really interesting as an idea. I don't think it's what Moss intended, so it depends if that's important to you or not.
Okay, and I'm going to come back to another question, but there is another question that slightly relates to that, which says, so this is from Joe MacDonald. Thank you, Lucy, for a fantastic talk. I'm interested in the notion of possibility that you see represented in the double line. And she or he asks if, does it have a physical parallel?
A physical parallel?
Yes. If you're not sure what they mean by that, perhaps they could expand in the chat and we can come back to that. And I'll just put the question above, or if you're ready, sorry, I did.
I can kind of talk around these ideas more and more, because it's so kind of expansive and it's so full of possibilities. I think all of Moss's work is very physical. I mean, it literally is nothing but its form. I think it's not figurative, it's not literal. I think it is physical. But if Joe means
I think Joe has expanded to say, sorry to talk over you.
Morphology or quantum, goodness me, I don't know. I would love to hear more about this, Joe. It sounds potentially exciting. But yes, I think I mean, there's all sorts of this kind of doubling and repeating is a really interesting theme. It's kind of it can be you can bring in Derrida and all sorts of things to that, with the idea of doubling and dualism. So yes, absolutely, why not? I think Moss might enjoy those ideas.
Okay, and then finally, Jan Cox says, I'm talking soon about the 1985 Tate show. Could you clarify? Did you say that Alan Bonus specifically excluded her?
Wow. Okay. This is a little bit gossip and hearsay. At the early part of my PhD research, I talked to people who were involved in the establishment of Tate St. Ives, such as Mike Tooby, and I talked to the widow of Martin Rewcastle. Martin Rewcastle had written a great deal about Moss at the time of, and he gave a talk at the opening of Tate St. Ives, and so there was several people who were trying to kind of insert Moss back into the story at that point of the inauguration of Tate St. Ives, through various different gossip and hearsay, and it does come a lot from from records and letters from Michael Caney, particularly, who was an artist, and also he was the director of the New Lynn Art Gallery, and he specifically said in letters that are kept in the women's art collection at Goldsmiths, if you want to look this up, he claimed several times that that this was the truth of the situation, that Alan Bonus had specifically excluded her and said that her work and Moss's work would not be on the walls of this show, or on his watch. But it's all gossip and and hearsay.
Thank you. And then many more thanks. And also, Flip asks, do you think there'll be a Marlow Moss exhibition in the foreseeable future?
Yes, I really, really hope so. There's often interest in moss, and tellingly, a lot of the interest is in Europe rather than in the UK. But there's people there's institutions that want to exhibit moss, and I really hope that one of these projects. I have irons in the fire. I hope one of these projects comes off.
Well, we all hope so too. We're absolutely thrilled to have her at Ben Gallery, and it's a fabulous piece. Thank you so much for that talk, Lucy. It's been wonderful. I think I should bring it to a close so that you can have your supper. And I just want to thank Reka for her behind the scenes presentation this evening. And also, please note, everybody, there's no talk next week, but to make up for it, there will be two fabulous events the following week. So on Monday, the 16th of October, we'll have Nina Perlman from UCL, Harriet Loeffler from the Women's Art Collection, and Sasha Llewellyn, founder of Rediscovering Art by Women, who will be joining myself and Una for a panel discussion about the historical and contemporary representation of women artists in public collections, including their own. And on Wednesday, the 18th, Rebecca Birrell will be reimagining rooms, drawing on her recent acclaimed book, This Dark Country, Women Artists, Still Life and Intimacy in the Early 20th Century. So don't forget to visit the exhibition. Meantime, continue to follow us online. And thank you so much to Lucy for a brilliant talk. Good evening, everyone. Letting all the thanks come through, and then we'll